Hello, I'm Nick Fry. I'm the curator of the John W. Baird III National Railroad Library. I'm also the archivist of the B&O Railroad Historical Society. This presentation is on the Ohio and Mississippi Railway. It's a presentation that's very much in progress. It's growing over time. It's actually a companion piece to a project I'm working on for the Historical Society about a history of this railroad and its successors. The O&M was really the first railroad that allowed St. Louis to connect with the eastern seaboard via rail. It was not a continuous, unfettered connection, but it was a great improvement over the previous arrangements, and it deserves some examination. It's an interesting story. It had some interesting highlights to its life, and I hope you all will enjoy this. Why build a railroad in the first place? Particularly, why build this railroad? Well, in St. Louis and Cincinnati and other parts of the West and Midwest, the 1840s were a time of great development. And by that, I mean settlement, growth, commercial development, agricultural development, and transportation development. And that expands in the second half of the 1840s almost exponentially with the defeat of Mexico in the Mexican War. This is a significant addition of territory to the United States. We had already annexed Texas. The win over Mexico allows us to get essentially the entire Southwest that we know today added to the territory of the United States in a surprisingly straightforward victory for American forces. It set St. Louis up and New Orleans as the two cities that would benefit the most from the expanded settlement of this area. St. Louis, because of its position on the Ohio River and the Mississippi, and then the Missouri. It was kind of a checkpoint where if you're coming in from the Northeast and you're heading southwest, you're probably going to wind up needing to stop in St. Louis for something. New Orleans, if you're going to go the long way around, is the big ocean port. And you could either do that or go into places like Galveston or things to go into Texas from there. But St. Louis is going to be experiencing growth. And by 1846, this image here shows what the city of St. Louis looked like. It was a pretty prosperous town and a location worthy of railroad expansion. The other end of this line is Ohio, in this case the Ohio River, and the city of Cincinnati. This is what Cincinnati looked like in the late 1840s. The lithograph on the left, and then the photograph, which is actually one of four panoramic images of the Cincinnati waterfront. And it is quite extraordinary. Just imagine that image with four times over. Cincinnati is a growing town. It's a major river port on the Ohio. It's where a lot of traffic coming out of Ohio and Indiana funnels into Cincinnati to get on steamboats to go east or west. The initial railroad development in the city is the Little Miami Railroad, which goes from Cincinnati up the Miami River north of town. It's trying to draw that traffic into Cincinnati. Canals are coming out of that area to, again, bring traffic into Cincinnati. The Cincinnati and Whitewater Canal is going into Indiana to bring that traffic in. Just to let you kind of get an idea of what's going on in a decade, Cincinnati in 1840 had 46,338 people living in the city. By 1850, that number is going to be 115,435. So you're seeing a significant growth of both these cities and they're well positioned to support a railroad project like the Ohio and Mississippi. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, the world is shrinking. And if you're going to stay competitive as a city, you've got to do that. And this is what we're looking at in terms of the shrinking of the world in terms of travel. This is from a historic atlas. It's a pretty common set of images where they look at rates of travel throughout time. This is 1800 to 1830. 1800, there's no steam travel. Roads are very rudimentary. We aren't that far away from the Revolution. And travel between New York and St. Louis is a little shade over 5 weeks, and that's if you are taking the rivers. By 1830, you've got steamboats, improved roads, some rail, but not really in 1830. This is mainly a turnpike improvement and a steamboat improvement. And you're looking at that travel time now, 2.5 weeks. And as technology is getting deployed to improve that number even further, any civic leader is going to want to be at the forefront of that. And of course, on the image at the left, that is from the Pennsylvania State Archives. That's a Tioga. It's this early Norris steam locomotive. This is what's going to be on the horizon. If you're in southern Ohio, southern Indiana, you are looking at that as your potential savior because you already have steamboats, and that's reliable. But there are some shortcomings in that you're dependent on the nature of the river for how well you can travel. In addition, you have the National Road as a competing travel system, which goes from Cumberland, Maryland to Vandalia, Illinois, through the middle of your state. It goes through Columbus, goes through Indianapolis, goes to Vandalia, and that's where it stops. Today, that's essentially Interstate 70, or US 40, really. And if you're in the southern portions of the state, you're concerned about. The northern portions, you have lakes that the Great Lakes help with your transit time, but you have a concern. You do also have railroad development going on. These lines here are existing railroads. This here are the overland mail routes, which, while interesting, are not yet something that's really going to be an impressive money-making opportunity. Certainly, you do want to try and capture mail traffic. Postal traffic gives you some additional protections from the federal government and a steady source of income, but that's not as important as just looking at where the railroad network is developing in 1850. And you notice there's no railroad yet between Cincinnati and St. Louis. There's lines out of Springfield, Indianapolis going down south, Cincinnati, there's a little Miami and the Cincinnati, what's going to become part of the Erie system going up to Columbus. The B&O, the Pennsylvania Railroad, it's going to become the New York Central, is working its way around. So we've got all of this development going on, and Cincinnati, St. Louis, everybody's looking at this saying, we got to get in on this or we're going to be left behind. So if you're going to build a railroad in the United States in the 19th century, you have to get charters from the states that allow you to legally build your railroad. And in this case, you're going to build through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And so you have to go to each of those state legislatures and ask them for a charter. Indiana, which they all kind of got the charter about the same time, they went ahead and signed off on it right away. 1848. Discussions in 1847, charter goes out shortly after that. O&M says, can we build? Indiana says, you got it, you're in. State of Ohio says, sure, but they say you can't make Alton the terminal, Alton, Illinois. And Illinois says, initially, Yes, but you have to make Alton the endpoint, and they had to renegotiate that. Eventually, they do change that so they can set their own terminal. Uh, they want to go to what is called Illinois Town at the time. We know it today as East St. Louis. That was the objective, to be right across the river from St. Louis. And that sets them up to build and compete against the National Road and other railroads. Now, Illinois' big roadblock was Alton. One problem with Illinois is in this situation is that who is going to be the big commercial center opposite St. Louis has not been settled. Alton is making a huge play. They are trying to get railroads built out of their town to go east. And they're banking on the fact that they are close to the mouth of the Missouri River, close to the mouth of the Illinois River, and along the Mississippi. That makes them lucrative and a strong candidate to be the up-and-coming commercial center in western Illinois along the Mississippi near St. Louis. Illinois Town would very much not like for that to happen. And that's the rub. John O'Fallon, who is the Illinois backer of the project, winds up being very successful in getting the state legislature in Springfield to remove that restriction, and construction begins. Alton, however, is going to keep trying on its own to build a rail connection and become a terminal point for some east-west railroad to interface with the river traffic and St. Louis proper. So once you have your charter, these folks who have now gotten permission from various states, you do have to figure out how much money you have to raise and where you're going to build the railroad. And what we're looking at here is a map from the O&M's report of the engineer. And you'll see it is a pretty much larger coverage area than you need it. In this case here, Cincinnati, there's East St. Louis. This is the line they're concerned with. And they hire a noted scientist named Ormsby M. Mitchell, and that's Mitchell right here. He is the city astronomer for Cincinnati. He's built the observatory there. He is a West Point graduate, served in the U.S. Army, has engineering skills, and he is a hometown guy as far as Cincinnati is concerned. That makes him politically palatable to hire. So he and his team go out and survey the route, and they say it's going to cost about $5 million to build. This is off by about a factor of 3. But they raise what they think is going to be $5 million. Unfortunately, you see things come up that are unexpected, but also you have to remember when these reports get published, they are done to get people to build the railroad in the first place. So you don't want to give everybody sticker shock. Now, Mitchell, once he does the survey, it's pretty much the end of his involvement with the O&M. He does come back in the pages of history, though. In 1862, he's a general in the United States Volunteers, and he's commanding a post in Chattanooga. And he winds up signing off on a project to steal a locomotive from the Western and Atlantic Railroad and run it back north to Chattanooga and destroy railroad bridges along the way. This becomes known as the Andrews Raid and is also now known as the Great Locomotive Chase. So the first of several little interesting sidelights and tangents for the O&M that appear in history. Very interesting guy. He actually dies of an illness before the war is over, so he never really gets to emerge afterwards and talk about what he really was trying to do with the project of the Great Locomotive Chase, and unfortunately also not talk about the O&M particularly when its fortune's reaching a nadir in the 1870s. Well, once you have your route picked in the 19th century, you've got to pick a gauge. It is not a standard thing. Gauge is the space between the two railroad rails. And in the 19th century, that was not something that they had standardized. You had Scottish, English, American, you had variations in this is actually from a British publication, so these are more British oriented gauges as opposed to American. But it's not standard. For the O&M, they do pick the wide gauge for the United States, which is 6 feet. And that is the O&M here. And it is 6 foot. You also have 5'6". You also have 5'4". You have 5 foot even. You have 4 feet 9 1/4. 4 feet 8 1/2, which is going to become the standard after the Civil War is over. 4'10", which is also called Ohio gauge, because a lot of railroads in Ohio had that. The O&M is kind of banking on the Erie, which is coming out of New Jersey, across the southern tier of New York, which also is 6 foot, and it's going to connect with a subsidiary railroad in Ohio. I believe that's the Atlantic and Great Western. That's going to go down to Cincinnati and ideally connect with the O&M. They're trying to be the broad gauge network. The company that winds up really embracing the O&M is not the Erie in the end. It's actually the Baltimore Ohio, and we see it here. And this is a post 1857 map, because the B&O subsidiary, the Northwest Virginia here at Grafton to Parkersburg, is in existence. And that's going to be how they're going to get to Cincinnati and then go to the O&M. So it's set up one way, it's going to happen another, but it's interesting. The two people that you're going to probably find out as you read are the most important people for the early days of the O&M are John Brough and John O'Fallon. Brough was the mayor of Cincinnati. He does wind up becoming the governor of Ohio. He is the guy that winds up going to Illinois and negotiating with the state legislature to get the charter passed without the Alton restriction. O'Fallon is a Southern Illinois figure, politically, economically. He's a colonel, a war veteran. And he has property in Illinois town that he is hoping will be developed by this project. O'Fallon, Illinois is named after him. O'Fallon, Missouri is named after him. And he is a big supporter on this side of the line for the project, as Brough is the supporter in Cincinnati. In 1854, once they had their charter from Illinois, they had about 3 years where they were raising money. And they started construction in Illinois town. They had to build a certain amount of track. In this case, they had to go to Lebanon, and they had to have that built by 1855 or the charter was going to be voided, which would be the end of the railroad unless they wanted to renegotiate the charter. You do something like that to try and guarantee the project's failure. Alton kind of got that. I think it may have been put in there initially as a compensation for the earlier demand going away. We may never know why it went there in the long run. That's something I'd like to research some more. But it's a backroom deal maybe, but we'll find out over time. What we're looking at here, this is a starting point. This is Illinois town. And this is overlaid on top of a more modern map. This is, these are the interstates. So this is 6470. Before 70, the new Musial Bridge was built that cut 70 off. So this is crossing the river, and you go over Illinois town, and then keep going to East St. Louis. These are also all of the flood control projects, Wiggins Ferry Complex. Wiggins Ferry is how you're going to get across the river. So that's another entity that's going to benefit commercially from the O&M, particularly if you look at where the end point is. So once you start at one end, you start at the other end. That's generally how these projects work. They concurrently started construction in Cincinnati in 1854. Going west, Illinois going east. The folks in Illinois made better time. They didn't have nearly the geological issues to deal with. Cincinnati's kind of a hilly city if you've ever been there. So they're going to try and keep very close to the river. They do build a station. It's not very impressive. It's kind of talked about as a horse corral, kind of a lean-to type structure. And then they head west along the river itself, hugging close to the shoreline because it's cheaper and easier to build that way when Mother Nature's done the excavation for you. On this side is the Cincinnati and Whitewater Canal, or the Whitewater Canal. It goes to from Cincinnati into Indiana. By the time construction's underway in the 1850s, it's pretty much a given that this project, this canal is on its last legs, and it won't last much past the Civil War's conclusion. It will actually be swept up by the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railroad. They'll put their right-of-way on top of it. Unfortunately for the O&M, that's a competitor to them. And it'll parallel the O&M to Lawrenceburg, and then it'll cross it and head north towards Indianapolis. For the O&M itself, you stay along the river as best you can, and then you're going to get to the expensive part of the railroad, which is the stone belt of Indiana. This is from the Indiana Geological Survey. And the O&M is going to be coming up basically right along here and hit this plateau. And through this limestone area, Mitchell, it's going to stay on basically parallel on 50. And once you get to Lagoudy, Indiana, things ease up quite a bit. You cross into the plains, flat, fairly level, easy construction. You got to go through the Wabash River Valley, but that's not nearly as expensive as trying to go through mountains and hills in the limestone country. And you make up time for what you lose. Now, however, this area is pretty rough, and it does require the construction of 2 tunnels. This is a photo from bridgehunter.com that shows a big tunnel. And this is the second of the 2 tunnels that were built. The first tunnel was a shorter tunnel. It's called Little Tunnel. It was eventually turned into a cut, and it's called Little Tunnel Cut now. Big Tunnel remains a tunnel. It doesn't see very much traffic these days, as you can see by how rusted the rails are. But it is still in existence, and theoretically it could see traffic again. The closest community to it is Tunnelton. As you can see, there was a lot of creativity with names regarding the tunnels. And those were the big engineering challenges that they had to deal with in this region. Granted, I mean, just cuts and fills are not fun, but a tunnel gets really expensive really quick, particularly in the 1850s when you don't have dynamite and things have to be dug out by hand. So by 1857, construction's finished on the railroad. And you see here, it's pretty straightforward. One thing they do early on is build a branch line down to Jeffersonville, Indiana, which is across the river from Louisville. That's an important traffic center, and it's going to wind up being a very important traffic center in the 20th century, but it is a lucrative source of traffic to get coal and products coming out of Kentucky, or get things to Kentucky by rail rather than putting them on a steamboat. They also wind up building branch lines to Shawneetown in the southern Illinois along the Ohio River. Itself was a pretty big agricultural center, so they're trying to tap into that agricultural market and take that off the steamboats. And also to Beardstown on the Illinois River, again, trying to take things off the steamboats predominantly agricultural products. And then, of course, you get to Illinois town, and then you've got a ferry boat ride to St. Louis, and then you're onto the one of the many railroads, the North Missouri, if you want to go way up out of St. Louis. You can take the Pacific, you can take the Iron Mountain. It depends on what you want to do with your trip. Power in general at this point is going to be 440 Americans. That was pretty standard at the early days of 440 Americans, a nice utilitarian locomotive at the time. They didn't have to worry so much about heavy grades. So, you know, you're not looking at like 8-wheel Winans camels or anything like that. They do cross several waterways, and being in the Ohio River drainage area, a lot of these are north-south flowing streams. So what they're looking at instead are a lot of bridges. Because they are undercapitalized, they tend not to go for very expansive stone arch bridges. You're seeing these stone piers with iron truss or wood bridges if you have to go that way. This is the Embark River in Illinois. And as you can see, it's an iron truss bridge. Structures along the railroad are pretty utilitarian. This is the freight house at Washington, Indiana. It was originally the O&M passenger station. And it's, you know, not real fancy. It just does its job. This is what the situation looks like in St. Louis. These black lines here are warehouses and freight stations. And all the railroads coming in from the east or the north, they all kind of stop. There's no bridge yet in 1857, so you have to take Williams Ferry to any of the ferry landings here on the St. Louis side of the river. So all of these are basically stub-end warehouse yards or freight station yards. And they're transferred over to the ferry boats, and then off they go. Some cars can go across. There is a rail line that runs along the river that allows traffic between the warehouses and freight stations. But Wiggins Ferry runs the show down here once you get to the shoreline. And that's why if you look at historic photographs or of the buildings, they all are perpendicular to the flow of the Mississippi River. This is where the yards look like in the 1930s, again, perpendicular to the flow of the Mississippi River. This is the Eads Bridge here, a combination road and rail bridge. And these are the old original freight yards, freight stations, and warehouses for the Eastern railroads that stopped here in East St. Louis. And the B&O Southwestern is what was the Ohio and Mississippi. So that is their plot of land. You can see as time developed, everybody's here. The Burlington, the Alton, the Vandalia, which is the Pennsylvania Railroad I mentioned, the L&N, the CCC and STL, that's the Big Four. That's a New York Central. It's Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad. The Illinois Central, and the Mississippi and Ohio, which becomes the GM&O Railroad. Or sorry, the Mobile and Ohio. Gosh, my apologies. Mobile and Ohio Railroad. And that's what they're at. It's 1857. There's been a cholera epidemic in 1849. St. Louis has recovered from that. There's been a fire. They've recovered from that. There's a panic in 1857. St. Louis is still a busy town. You've got all of this development going on in the Western territories newly gained from Mexico. You've got continued development going on in Kansas and Nebraska, Texas. California is still extremely lucrative, even though the gold rush has kind of played out. And that's what's going on. The O&M and other railroads are advertising lands. And in some case, as this image shows, this is lands along their right-of-way proper, timber, farmlands, Western markets that they serve. They're trying to get settlement, which gives them traffic, which helps improve their cash flow. They're also looking at the people going further west. This is actually a Boston advertisement for encouraging settlement in Kansas in 1855. This is 3 years before the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We're starting to see Bleeding Kansas, where settlement of free soil citizens in contested territories is happening to try and make sure those states come in as free states. It's kind of an outgrowth of the Missouri Compromise and then the Compromise of 1850. So this is also an outgrowth of the fact that the Erie and the Atlantic and Great Western is the preferred connection at this time. Broad gauge, which they advertise here in this broadside, and how much quicker the travel is. Buffalo, Cleveland, Indianapolis, you're going by the AGW. And then to St. Louis. And from there, they want you to go west. Now, in 1857, the focus on the Erie starts to fade because interest from the Baltimore Ohio Railroad start looking at the O&M. The B&O is a competing railroad to the Erie, to the Pennsylvania, to the New York Central. And they want to tap into the market. And they have bought control of a railroad in Virginia called the Northwestern Virginia Railroad. It basically follows US 50 from Parkersburg to Grafton. And it's pretty much a straight shot to the Ohio River. Chauncey Brooks is the president at the time. He was one of the folks in favor of this project. William Prescott Smith is the master of transportation. And he's also the PR guy. And what these two fellows decide to do is, once they really fully assume control of the Northwest Virginia, and they start making financial overtures to the Marietta and Cincinnati and the O&M, they decide, well, let's really promote our connection with the West by means of what we call the Great Railway Celebration of 1857. And they're going to do a special train from Baltimore, Maryland to St. Louis with dignitaries along the way. People will get on and get off, and they will, they'll ship oysters on the train to have a big feast in St. Louis. So they take the B&O west to Parkersburg. They cross the Ohio River, and they make their first connection to the Marietta and Cincinnati. Then they go to the Little Miami Railroad and go to Cincinnati, and then onto the O&M, and then go to St. Louis and have their party and promote it. Now, unfortunately, despite this association with the B&O, the O&M's fortunes really aren't improving that much. They are competing with steamboats. They are competing with other railroads now. And they took on a lot of debt to build their railroad line. They were undercapitalized, and they are hurting. The Panic of 1857 hurts them. The high service payments they have to make. You have to remember, in the 19th century, if you're building a railroad, you're using bonds and not stocks to fund it. So that's, you have to pay the interest on that bond, or you're going to go into receivership, and you're going to lose control of your company if you don't do that. So they start looking at how to improve their situation. One thing they do is they find out that there's a really talented guy in Illinois who's a vice president with the Illinois Central named George McClellan. And George McClellan was a very well-known figure in engineering and military circles. He was a brilliant engineer. He's graduated top of his class, well, not top, but in the top of his class at West Point. Mexican War Service, he went to the Crimea to observe the Crimean War, designed a improved saddle for U.S. cavalry service, and was a very well-respected engineer. And he was lured away from government service by the Illinois Central to be a vice president. And he was then lured away from the Illinois Central to be the president of the Eastern Division, which went from Vincennes, Indiana to Cincinnati of the Ohio and Mississippi. And he took that job in 1860. He held it for not even really a year because this little thing called the Civil War breaks out, and McClellan winds up eventually rising to the rank of commander-in-chief of all Union armies in 1862. And then very quickly falls from his point of grace. He'll run for president in 1864 and lose, and then wind up becoming the governor of New Jersey. But at this time, he was looked upon as a savior of the railroad through his experience with management and his experience with engineering and his reputation. They hoped he could help turn the fortunes of the company around. Unfortunately, we never really got to find out. This is 1862, a timetable for the railroad. And it did get very busy during the Civil War. Troops were going from the west to the east, concentrations of training camps. In fact, early in the war, there was a pretty disastrous train wreck where a train went, a trestle collapsed, and some volunteers were injured and killed in an accident. It was not good for the reputation of the railroad, but it was fixed. And it continued to move troops throughout the war, and it did improve the economic fortune somewhat of the company. It was involved with part of the transfer of troops from the east, the Army of the Potomac in 1863 to break the siege of Chattanooga. Some of those troops went on the O&M from Parkersburg across the river, Marietta and Cincinnati to the O&M. And then to Jeffersonville, where they crossed the river and marched to, or took trains to Louisville. After the war, though, southern Indiana was kind of a rough place. There was not a really clear-cut entirely Union population there. They did have a lot of commerce with the South. There were Southern sympathizers. And it wasn't a very populated area compared to other parts of the state. And after the war, there was a entity was formed with some brothers, Frank and John Reno, who had really made their earlier reputations as bounty jumpers during the war. They would sign up for a regiment to serve in the war, get the bounty, and then desert. That was how they started their criminal enterprises. After the war, they realized that there were opportunities for improved larceny. And what they wind up doing in 1866 is rob a train on the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. And they had the reputation of the first train robbers in the United States, organized train robbery. Which was on the O&M in 1866 outside of Seymour, Indiana. Now, why is there a picture of an Elvis movie? The story was the inspiration for the movie Love Me Tender, where Elvis plays a third Reno brother who's trying to get the boys to stay on the straight and narrow path with mixed results, of course. In real life, the Renos will continue to rob trains. They will rob trains in Marshfield. The site there on the right is where the original 1866 robbery was. They robbed trains on and off for about 2 years. They didn't do it very often. It wasn't like a weekly occurrence, but it was an opportunity where they tried. Pinkertons were sent after them. They were eventually captured. And they were lynched, unfortunately, in Indiana by folks who had just kind of gotten tired of their antics. So vigilante justice ended the reign of the Reno gang. There are some books out about them, and they're quite interesting. And anybody's curious, just contact me by email after this, and I'm happy to let you know. Now, as the 1870s go along, the railroad decides to spend some money and improve things. 1873, Unfortunately, another year of a panic. They have improved their barn-like depot in Cincinnati with a more architecturally pleasing building. The Eads Bridge is built in St. Louis in 1875, meaning that they no longer need to traverse the river via the Wiggins Ferry Company. And it's something that the O&M really plays up the Eads Bridge. Also in the 1870s, the gauge is standardized. 1874 actually is when that happens. They go from 6 foot to 4 feet 8.5 inches. And it's it's easy to go narrower because you don't have to add on to your railroad ties. You just move the rail closer to the other. You only have to move one rail, and you're in good shape. Now, along the railroad line, you've got some towns, and we're going to go and take a look a little bit at some of the architecture here. This is actually from a funeral parlor site in Flora, Illinois. It's a great picture that shows 3 trains in Flora. They all were scheduled to meet at the same time so that people could transfer. One train is going east to Cincinnati, one train is going west to St. Louis, the other train is going between Shawneetown and Beardstown on the Beardstown-Shawneetown line that goes through Springfield, Illinois. And this is after the B&O had taken over, but it's interesting to see the building on the left is the original Flora Depot. It's 2 stories. It's not very exciting, but it's there, and they did schedule their meets quite nicely. Now, in the 1870s, there's a new leader at the B&O named John Garrett. He is a just as visionary a person as Chauncey Brooks was in the 1850s, but he really wants to pick a fight. He wants to go toe-to-toe with the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central. And he thinks one thing he can do is take advantage of the existing relationships the B&O has with the lines in Ohio and the O&M and take them over. So throughout the 1860s and 1870s and into the 1880s, the B&O starts exerting more and more financial control over these companies by buying their bonds, by then buying stock, by then putting more and more representatives of the B&O on these boards in a very friendly, supportive, but don't mess with us kind of takeover. And gradually that is going to change the character of the company. Now, this is an 1870s timetable, 1872. This is from the collection of Carlos Schwantes. This is the O&M right after the war. They're doing Louisville traffic. They're doing Pullman cars. Now notice it's Washington and Baltimore and not New York and Boston as the eastern cities being promoted. So you can see the B&O interest is already there. They're promoting the connection with the B&O. Still, 1871, this is what the General Western Agents business card looks like, another Carlos Schwantes item, promoting the broad gauge. This is going to last for a few more years, but not much longer, and it'll be standard gauge. Broad gauge is also advertised because it's supposedly easier ride, a more comfortable ride. It's like when you buy an SUV, some of them advertise how wide the wheel bases are to help us improve stability and handling on curves. Well, that's also what they're thinking with the broad gauge of the railroad. Wider gauge, wider wheels, more stability. Unfortunately, the operating costs really don't pan out. Again, O&M's really trying to compete after the war. Push for Texas, 1878 here. Reconstruction is over. They're still looking at rebuilding the South. There's a lot of opportunities, improvements in cattle transportation. Beef is an opportunity. People are looking to go to Texas and make a fortune in cotton and livestock. There's no oil of note yet, but those are the areas they're looking at making money in. Unfortunately, the O&M goes into receivership in 1876. Long-term costs from construction, panic of 1857, panic of 1873, competition. They finally just get too much to bear, and they're in receivership by 1876. In 1882, the B&O comes in, and they've started to merge into the Marietta and Cincinnati, so your connection now has moved further west. And in 1889, the O&M gets merged into the B&O Southwestern, a standalone holding company controlled by the Baltimore Ohio Railroad. And the B&O Southwestern controls lines from the Ohio River to St. Louis. They don't worry about the Chicago line that's done separately, but the St. Louis, the lines to Louisville, the lines to Indianapolis, those are the concerns of the B&O Southwestern. And that's going to stay as a standalone company until World War I, actually. In fact, here's a 1904. This is the guidebook that the railroad put out for the World's Fair in St. Louis. And it is B&O Southwestern. It is, we're technically not the B&O, but yeah, we kind of are the B&O. We're using the Capitol Dome logo, which is a B&O marketing symbol. We're everything except the letterhead, the B&O. And one nice thing about a company like the B&O coming in, it did improve the financial situation. This is Shoals, Indiana. And, the wooden bridges, the iron bridges were improved with steel. This is the pumping station for Shoals. The station's a little further on this side. Improvements and investments were being made in the infrastructure to help keep this railroad competitive. As locomotives got heavier and cars got heavier and longer, you needed to improve your infrastructure to be able to handle the weights. Flora. Where that two-story wooden station? Well, that's gone now. This is a shot from the city of the Flora Depot, which is now the City Historical Society. Noble, Indiana. You can see a pretty bland, small station. This is probably an O&M vintage structure with straight clapboard siding, because once the B&O takes over, stations start to get a little bit more expansive. This is Olney, Illinois. This is their station with tower. They had a crossing there with another railroad. And you can see it's brick with stone at the bottom. That was a B&O project. There's a better view of it. This is Odin, another Union Depot. Lawrenceville, Illinois. Another crossing. Bridgeport. And you can see the vertical siding. That's kind of a hallmark of O&M when it was still independent. And this is the later B&O style depot. This actually is probably a 1900s vintage structure. And I say that because there's a standard book from 1907 that was published by the railroad when the Pennsylvania Railroad took over. And you see you've got the vertical board siding here, and then horizontal wood siding. That is very much a Pennsy 1907 era trademark of the B&O. So I'm thinking this is after that takeover. And they build a lot of these all over the railroad, these standardized structures. And that's why I'm thinking this is what's going on after the B&O took over. Vincennes, Indiana. The structure is still there, but this is the B&O. And I want to say this is the C&EI, I think. I'm not sure. If it is, let me know by email, and I can maybe update this. But it was another Union depot. It used to have a hotel on this site. A station had a hotel, but then it just became a depot. North Vernon was where there was a major crossing of what became a New York Central line to Louisville. It's still a pretty busy place as far as things go because it is a line to Louisville. And again, investments, nice brick stations. That is not what it looks like today, but at one time it was quite a place. This is Mitchell. Mitchell was another crossing point. Mitchell was also where the Milwaukee Road was in Indiana. People don't really, unless you really are interested in Indiana railroad history or a Milwaukee Road fan, you don't think about the Milwaukee Road going into Indiana, but it did, and it went into Mitchell. And Mitchell is also famous for another thing. There was an astronaut from Mitchell, one of the Mercury 7, Gus Grissom. Virgil I. Gus Grissom is a native of Mitchell, and his father worked for the B&O. And there's still folks I know who remember talking or hearing Mr. Grissom. He was with the signal maintainers over the radio out of the Washington, Indiana shops back in the day. And there they are. That's the Grissom family right there. And Gus was the second man in space after Alan Shepard. He commanded the first Gemini mission. He would have commanded Apollo 1, but he was tragically lost in the fire with his crewmates Ed White and Roger Chaffee in 1967. But Gus is well remembered in his hometown. Very interesting books about him and growing up. And the family was featured on one of the last covers of B&O Employees magazine in 1962. His parents were on there because of their work on his dad's work on the B&O. The railroad had plenty of passenger traffic. It was well known for the National Limited, which got a lot of play when Harry Truman became president and would travel on that. And the National Limited as a train would last into Amtrak, but it would not be on the same routing. Its glory days ended in the late 60s. You had other trains such as the Shenandoah that ran along this line, the Diplomat would be on this line, and unnamed mail trains that had rider coaches attached to it. And the freight business on the railroad, it's interesting. The B&O's development of the O&M route, they really didn't do much physical improvement. They did do one big change when they moved the division midpoint from Vincennes to Washington. There was a big string of locomotives that took everything from the divisional headquarters in Vincennes to the new shops in Washington, Indiana. That occurred during the O&M's ownership. And B&O improved on the shops at Washington over time and really developed that. Freight traffic was mainly through freights, things coming from St. Louis to the east or going to St. Louis. And the passenger trains, similar mindset. Your objective is St. Louis and connecting with the Western railroads. And there were Katy coaches and Frisco coaches and coaches. Katy, Mopac, and Frisco cars would be on some B&O trains and vice versa for uninterrupted sleeper car service to the Southwest. And other Eastern railroads did the same thing. And unfortunately, that practice all really ends when Amtrak comes about, and the nature of rail travel changes to more of a hub and spoke kind of situation. And the National Limited really ends in 1972. And the freight trains continue on until the 90s on the B&O route, until the Conrail, what we call the Conrail merger, the Conrail split, when what had been the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1974 were combined into a single company after a really bad marriage in the 60s called Penn Central. That's turned into Conrail. And it split in the 90s between Norfolk Southern and CSX. And what happens is most of that freight traffic gets pulled from the B&O to the Pennsylvania Railroad to go into Indianapolis, where they can stay on high capacity, high speed lines and go east from there, rather than a somewhat more tortuous route through West Virginia and Western Pennsylvania on old B&O track. So that's kind of where it stands. The line itself, the track for the most part is still there, but rail has been cut at Salem, Illinois, so it is out of service. What we know as of 2020, CSX is kind of keeping it in its back pocket. They own it. They are not running very much on it. It is not complete anymore because of the cut rail. There are certain portions that are out of service today. It is used in some spots for car storage, and there still are some customers served by locals, but for the most part, it's laying fallow. And we really don't know what the future will hold for this. But it's a very interesting railroad, despite it being pretty much a straight line. It's got a lot of little interesting tidbits. And as time goes on, this talk's going to get expanded and enhanced with more images and more documentation. So I thank you for your time. If you do have questions, you can reach me through the library at FRYN, as in Nick, at uniform Mike, SL, Sierra Lima, .edu. And we appreciate it. If you have some resources or recollections you wouldn't mind sharing, please let me know. This is a project that the B&O Historical Society is interested in, the Barrier Library is interested in, because of its local connection. And we'd like any additional information and resources we can find. So thanks very much, and have a great day.